Welcome to Ali Fitness Podcast, a weekly production all about bringing health into fitness. Ed Haynes is the founder and head of performance and programming at Coastal Performance Training, CFPT. He's a former Hong Kong international rugby player, but chose to follow a career in fitness after seeing the benefits of sound strength and conditioning principles, which helped him recover, I believe, from many major injuries during his playing career. So not your traditional CrossFit gym, nor your regular personal training studio. I've asked Ed to come on the show today to explain why his facility is very different and why it's been recommended by many, including the Spartan Race organisers. So firstly, Ed, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ali. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So let's get started with your background. So what's your background and how did you come to open a fitness and, more to the point, a CrossFit gym, if we're going to call it that?
Yeah, we'll get to that bit in a sec. Yeah, let's rewind the clock then, I guess. I grew up in Hong Kong. I was actually born here. Kind of grew up, my family's a fairly sporty family, playing all sports, but basically became very fond and I guess had some talent in football and rugby. And then kind of your typical teenage journey of self-exploration in the gym. Ended up, joining fitness first. And in fact, even before that, I think my dad bought me a bench press in my room when I was about 13, 14 and just kind of got into the weights room early and just started playing around with all sorts of stuff. And obviously did all the wrong things. And where that kind of led me to eventually was picking up a lot of injuries in my rugby career. And I think a lot of my passion for this industry has kind of stemmed from that and making sure that other people don't do the same and kind of sharing my thoughts on and my experiences on my journey through injury and prehab and then getting back to competitive sport. That was the roots of it all. I eventually went to university in the UK. And after finishing university, I came back to Hong Kong. And at the point, I had big aspirations to play professional rugby. So I was already a member of the Hong Kong Sevens and Hong Kong 15s team at the time. And I guess kind of when you're that age, playing professional sport as a sporty kid is kind of what everyone dreams about, I guess. And at the time, rugby was just moving to that professional era where they were offering full-time contracts and Hong Kong-based players were thinking about, moving to Japan and having careers there. And it was all quite exciting. But then I kind of found that after getting into the Hong Kong rugby setup, I, for some reason, seemed to develop more of a passion for the actual training process, more so than the rugby itself. And I kind of got addicted to the journey of, physical self-improvement, I guess. And was constantly talking and berating and questioning my strength and conditioning coach at the time. And it was almost like I was more passionate about everything we did in the weights room and a training standpoint than actually results on the field, which is probably not the best mindset to have as a professional athlete. So eventually, whilst playing rugby for Hong Kong, I got into personal training. I was so passionate about exercise, it just made sense. And I kind of woke up one day and decided that this is my career and I was going to give it everything to make sure it was going to be successful. So I founded Coastal Fitness Performance Training in 2009. And at the time, it was pretty much all individualized coaching. Basically did program design for individuals in sport, but also just kind of the everyday person and personal training. And I think maybe about 2 years down the line, we eventually started to get into group training a little bit. And that was primarily, we were kind of traveling around office spaces, private studios, going to schools, kind of like every freelance personal trainer does. But we actually started offering group classes, and our group classes were not necessarily CrossFit, because I think in 2009, CrossFit was, even in America, which is kind of its roots, was very much in its growth stages. So no one really knew about it. But kind of looking back and looking at the stimulus we used to provide for our group class clients, it was almost the same. It was always an element of strength training using, things like TRXs and bodyweight type movements. But we also had a big collection of kettlebells and sandbags and all that kind of stuff. So we had a group program called SMAC, which was really successful back then, a lot of fun. We actually ended up building up a really big community of people who just kind of wanted to work hard, get strong, get fit, but kind of be competitive as well. So the SMAC program took off in a way. It was at the time where everyone was getting into outdoor group training. And I guess that kind of, from where SMAC grew to and all the people that got involved, I think we eventually had almost 300 people who were doing our group classes across Hong Kong. We were, I guess at that point as a company, we had 4 or 5 coaches, all of us full time. were getting a bit frustrated with having to rent training spaces that didn't offer a full set of equipment that we wanted to offer our clients, obviously limited by booking space and space itself. We kind of stumbled across the idea 4.5 years ago of actually opening up our own facility. And that's where, Coastal Fitness Performance Training, I guess, really first person to the scene when we opened up our space in North Point, which we're currently still at. And I guess apart from the frustrations, two of the main reasons we wanted to open that was, one was a customized facility, but also to have a headquarters and really start to build a community of like-minded coaches and clients. And I guess fast forward to today, here's where we are.
Right. So did you have previous experience with yourself training in a CrossFit gym?
No, actually how I came across CrossFit was quite funny. So all of my early developments as a coach and as a trainer, well, obviously firstly came from working with my coach in rugby, who was a big strength and conditioning guy, went through all your kind of Poliquin type certifications, as well as did a CSCS at university. Very classical approach to strength and conditioning. And so I guess my first 2 or 3 years as a trainer, a lot of my program design stemmed from that kind of background. Really successful training methodology and, was fully believed in it. And actually one of my colleagues, and I'll give him a shout out, Andy Bratsanos, he had a fairly failed sporting career and basically was looking for something new to kind of get into to make his own. And he stumbled across CrossFit. And he found it actually online, just kind of browsing through the internet, stumbled across CrossFit.com, which I think a lot of people back then, that's how the CrossFit journey started. CrossFit.com used to post these workouts online every day, which were free of charge. And basically people would do the workouts and comment and kind of leave their scores. So this online community started to develop through the CrossFit HQ site. So anyway, my colleague Andy started getting into it. He was doing the workouts every day. And if you know anything about what the CrossFit.com workouts are, they're just insane. It can be anything from go out for a 20K run to, some heavy barbell movement coupled with high skill gymnastics movements like snatches and muscle ups. The next day you're doing, some crazy 60-minute workout involving all sorts of stuff. So anyway, I was obviously watching Andy do this and I was still playing rugby at the time. And I was questioning, we had some really good conversation about it. I just thought it was the most ridiculous training methodology I'd ever seen. There was no structure, there's no progression, there's no periodization. It just seemed like it was randomized training that they were throwing at people. And the harder you worked and the more pain you were in, the better the workout was. And that obviously went against a lot of my early principles and my development, my career. So it actually, my first experience with CrossFit is very different to what most people will usually say, which is kind of like they did this workout and they were hooked. My first experience was actually, I learned about the methodology and actually just thought it was ridiculous.
I'm curious to ask you about that. The point you mentioned, your training was in SC and SC, and you were quite happy following that sort of systematic approach. You mentioned that you were a bit dubious of this crazy sort of workout. Did you change your mind about that, or do you still feel the same way?
So the way I believe a CrossFit program should be delivered to an individual or a group still follows very much my classical way of thinking, which it needs to be in a systematic, periodized program approach. But I guess kind of rewinding back to that instant was where that whole conversation with Andy and my frustrations in this sport and seeing all these people doing it and messing themselves up. It was coincidentally, I think about a month later, CrossFit HQ had announced that they were going to run a level 1 coaching seminar in Singapore. And so Andy was obviously all for it. He was like, look, I'm going to do it. I want to learn more about this. And I basically said, look, I'm going to do it because, well, A, I just love learning new stuff, but B, I need to actually speak to these guys and find out what the hell they're doing. Because maybe I misinterpreted what CrossFit HQ was. So I kind of wanted to actually get there and learn firsthand what it was about. So I said yes to it, and myself, Ant, who's one of the coaches at Coastal, my brother, and Andy went down to Singapore to learn. I actually left that weekend with more questions than answers, still wasn't sold, still thought it was ridiculous. I remember going there with this big list of questions written out as to kind of like some of my confusions or maybe misconceptions of the sport and the training methodology. And I remember asking the seminar staff at the time, and I actually didn't get any good answers. And I actually almost seemed like the questions I was asking was the first time I'd had to deal with these kind of questions. And I think, retroactively looking back, at that time, a lot of people doing CrossFit didn't actually have sporting backgrounds. So they'd kind of gone from just doing nothing to just, trying this training methodology and falling in love with it. But because they were so, I guess, open-minded and had no preconceived ideas as to what training should be, everyone just kind of went along with it. Whereas I guess myself, I'd had 3 or 4 years already in the industry and 6 or 7 years as an athlete being exposed to classic S&C. So I guess I sat in a bit of a different boat there. I left that seminar more confused, still frustrated, still didn't have the answers that I wanted, and kind of came back and started just doing more of my own research. And at the time, I actually also started doing it more myself. So I was playing around with the workouts, joining in with some of the workouts that Andy was doing, trying to kind of wrap my head around, if there was a systematic approach that I just couldn't really see, maybe there was something that was new and blah, blah, blah. But really what it turned out to be was that CrossFit's whole idea was that constantly varied high intensity was the key to success. And the key to success meaning the more you can keep your body guessing and the more variance you expose it to, the better it's going to get. Which, of course, if anything about classic strength and conditioning, it's a complete opposite to what you learn. You learn that you need to provide a stimulus to your body and eventually you'll adapt and hopefully positively adapt. I guess the turning point for me in falling in love with CrossFit rather than being frustrated with CrossFit was about a year later, a guy called James Fitzgerald basically kind of burst onto the scene. And James Fitzgerald had a company called OPT at the time, which stood for Optimum Performance Training. And James Fitzgerald, he actually came from a classical S&C background, American football coach. He worked with Charles Poliquin. He was very instrumental in designing the PICP certifications. And he basically stumbled across CrossFit like I had, but he'd done it 3 years before. He competed in the first CrossFit Games and basically said, this training methodology that everyone's doing it is ridiculous. If you want to be successful in a sport and have long-term progression, you need to have a systematic approach to the training methodology. Because the training and the sport was so new, no one really knew how to do that. So I think James Fitzgerald was one of the first guys to start to create a system where you could periodically improve people at the sport, not through constant variance and not just by throwing hard workouts at them, but by actually planning in things like microcycles and macrocycles like we do in classic S&C. And so I started watching videos online and reading some of this guy's content, and it just kind of clicked. I was like, okay, this is great. There's actually someone else in the industry who disagrees with classic CrossFit and what they teach, who agrees that there needs to be a systematic approach to it, and who's actually trying to do something about it to improve the way that coaches deliver the training methodology. So I actually then went on kind of like a 2-year journey of doing OPT, which is now called OPEX. It's online certifications, and I kind of completed the whole level 1 module. And after that, it all just started making sense to me. And then I guess that brings me to where I am today, which is, typically how I view the sport and how I think the training should be delivered to clientele.
Excellent. So, Ed, in a nutshell then, you're CrossFit with a systematic approach?
Yeah, basically, I guess that's what you could call it.
Okay. And so can you just explain to our listeners, how do you bring in this systematic approach, micro, macro levels? How do you bring that into the training? Give us a real life example of someone that might come to your gym and how they'd experience that versus a general CrossFit gym.
Yeah, for sure. So I think firstly to distinguish who the client is and what they're actually after. So I think if we took, most of the people that we deal with at Coastal Fitness Performance Training are just kind of just general everyday people who are looking to get leaner, look good naked, develop some strength, develop some basic capacity in the aerobic and anaerobic systems. And they like the idea of CrossFit because it's community driven and it's group based, and they probably read something online that looks cool and they kind of want to get involved in it. So I think if we use an example for that client, it would be very, very different to someone who has, let's say, 10 years of training experience in competitive sport, who's already very strong, already very fit, and wants to pursue the sport and actually compete in it. So if we talk about your general consumer who just kind of wants to start getting into the training methodology, I think at the end of the day, CrossFit doesn't really differ from any other sport in the sense that if you have no weight training experience or no just general training experience, you need to start with the absolute basics. And that doesn't mean putting a barbell on your back and back squatting it, or putting a barbell in your hands and deadlifting it, or trying to get after Olympic lifting and all the crazy stuff that I guess a lot of people do in their very first CrossFit session. It means, first and foremost, understanding and learning how to control your body through space. And typically that's going to be unloaded. And then basically developing all facets of strength. So you're starting with strength endurance and then eventually developing hypertrophy and moving eventually towards absolute strength and eventually power. And if you looked at like a systematic approach to that, that could take, anywhere between 1 to 3 years before you're actually doing really, really heavy loads, depending upon the individual. And of course, starting basic and then moving towards complex, starting with single modality, then moving towards mixed modality. So I think kind of that's just a really simple general way to do it. So how that might look for someone who, came into our gym and was working one-on-one with a coach and said, hey, like I want to start getting into this CrossFit thing. I've seen it online, see you guys do group classes. The first thing we obviously have to do is start with an assessment and really see where that client's at. A lot of times for clients who wanted to get into our group classes, they're just actually not in a position to even think about that because they have either past injuries, imbalances, or the goals just don't match up. How it would look from a training prescription is, just like you would do with anyone really, starting with a bias towards movement and mobility type work, single leg, single limb, ironing out imbalances, making sure you're addressing pushing, pulling, hinging, squatting, and all planes of movement. And then just really simply developing some form of capacity through, things like assault biking, rowing, pushing a sled, pulling a sled, all those kind of things versus going straight after the fancy stuff and doing, kind of like 20 minutes of 10 different movements as fast as you possibly can. I hope that's made sense.
Absolutely. And I think that's another thing that makes you unique. I've heard of many, many instances where someone will go into a CrossFit gym, never been into one, walk out having done exactly what you said, this barbell on the back, major squats, and they can't even squat without a weight, let alone with a weight. So that's great. So you go in, you do an assessment, a personal assessment, assuming then that the coach agrees that you're ready to start a group class. Do you jump straight into a CrossFit class at your gym, or is there a progression?
Yeah, so let's take that same client as an example. So let's say in our first initial conversations, they'd express an interest to want to get into group classes. We're always very honest with them from the start to say, hey, look, like there are some prerequisites that we want all our clients to be able to do before we even start our journey towards working towards group classes. So that very first step is to do an assessment. And the assessment is not to see how strong you are or what weights you can lift or what skills you've unlocked through, previous training experiences, but it's really to see if you're structurally in a position to start exposing yourself to, the type of movements that we have in our group classes. And so typically, just like you said, we're looking if you can control your body in an unweighted, unloaded squat. We're looking at right to left imbalances in the upper and lower body. We're looking at, the ability to control your scapula, the ability to put your arms over your head without excessively moving into extension through your spine. All those basic prerequisites of movement that you'd expect or that you'd want someone to have before going into, I guess, really any form of loaded strength class. So that might be, I think the same process should be applied to things like body pump. And I know it's called grit, I think, that they're running in a lot of gyms, F45 and, all the different kind of mixed modal type training methodologies. I think that's 99% of injuries stem from people just not being ready for the stimulus that they actually are exposed to in classes. Or the same can be said about personal training.
Ed, I agree, but do you think there's an issue there with impatient clients and potentially, and you must see this all the time, you explain to the client, well, you've actually got to do some personal training sessions first so that we're sure that you're okay. And do you lose clients over that? One, either they can't afford it, or two, they're just not interested. They just want to get in and sweat.
Yeah, that's a really good point. 100%. We've definitely had people walk away because they haven't been interested in, well, firstly, I guess financially investing in the process of learning to get themselves to a point where they can join group classes. And B, just being impatient and just wanting that really quick fix and wanting to kind of, get in there and start training hard instead of addressing all the kind of fundamentals that I think people should have before they get into any training program. So definitely we do get some resistance to it, but I think at the end of the day, the people that do commit to the process and who believe in it, will have a lot more longevity with their training, they'll be a lot more educated as well. And at the end of the day, for our coaches, it just makes it a really, really pleasant, really cool training environment, because across the board, all of our clientele in the group classes are, they have a certain level of understanding already. And I guess also a certain level of commitment, because they've gone through that longer, process to even get there.
And so this client that we're using as an example, they come in, they've been assessed by the personal trainer over X number of sessions. They're now ready for a group class. What group class would they do?
Cool. So I actually skipped out a bit there. So once you've completed the assessment with us, our coach has a very honest conversation to say, hey, so like these are the prerequisites that we'd like you to be able to do before starting your journey. This is where we're at. More often than not, a client's able to meet the prerequisites, but sometimes we do have clients who just aren't in a position to even start the process. And the process is actually called the fundamentals program. So if a client isn't able to meet the prerequisites for starting fundamentals, then we have an honest conversation and say, hey, look, if group training is still really what you want, then we need to supplement, or we need to start with some personal training. And we can provide you with some accessory work that you can do by yourself, but most of our training is going to be spent together, where we can actually guide you. And actually a lot of times, funnily enough, clients will agree to that and say, yeah, I'm all for that. Let's do it. And then kind of 2 or 3 sessions in, they're like, either I'm a really long way away from where I need to be, and therefore I'd rather invest my time in an individualized approach to training, or they say, yeah, let's just kind of scrap the whole group thing altogether because it's probably not for me. And so the ones that actually do pass that assessment process, they then go into a program called Fundamentals. And Fundamentals is typically split over 5 to 7 sessions, and it's working one-on-one with the coach to basically address the basic principles of the movements that they're going to be exposed to in classes. So I guess it's primarily an educational process for the client who does it, but also we're indirectly assessing every client who does a fundamentals program, because we're getting to work with the client every single day over anywhere between 1 to 6 weeks, depending how quickly they can get it in. And so at the end of the day, you've developed a really good relationship with a client and a coach, but we can also create a feedback loop into our group classes and the other coaches to say, let's say John Smith just passed his fundamentals program. A couple of things we want to look out for: his right ankle tighter than his left. So let's start by adjusting his squatting to a box instead of full depth squatting, but I think he should be good to go. So I just think it's a good system that we've adapted and evolved over time.
Great. I love the approach. I really love it. And so after that, the fundamentals program's done, all approved, maybe a few little adjustments. What next?
Yeah, so next, they've gone through the fundamentals process, and now they're in a position to start group classes. And so our group class is a little bit different from, I think, a lot of other CrossFit gyms, in the sense that we have a multi-tiered group program. So group sessions run throughout the day and throughout the week, but within each group session, we have 3 tiers. One of the tiers being the fitness program, one being the performance program, and one being the competitors program. So our fitness program is actually our busiest program. So we have the largest number of followers following our fitness program. The goal of the fitness program is to develop all strength qualities, from strength endurance to absolute strength and power, exposure to basic energy system training, both single modality and mixed modal, basically cultivate mobility and solid movement patterns, and to kind of constantly teach and expose them to new movements which have carryover to everyday life. So the fitness program, those are the main objectives. And then the next program we have is the performance program. The performance, I guess, and the competitors program are for anyone who has aspirations to compete in the sport of CrossFit. And I think that's kind of, we'll probably talk about it later, but one of the biggest issues with our industry is that competing for CrossFit, or competing in the sport of CrossFit, and using CrossFit as a training methodology for health are 2 very, very different things. It's not to say that the performance program is like a level 2 or a progression from the fitness program. It's more that the performance program has a completely different set of goals from the fitness program. So a lot of our men and women who follow the fitness program are really just there to be healthy, develop strength, and all the positives that come along with that, like bone density and ligament strength, etc. But to basically do that in a fun, competitive group environment and be a part of a community, but have no real aspirations to ever compete in, let's say, a CrossFit competition or the CrossFit Open, or the other things that people generally compete in the sport. And it's not to say that it's not progressive and it's not periodized. We still apply the same, systematic approach to programming for our fitness clients, in the sense that I always say this, that even if I followed a fitness program, for 4 or 5 years, I'd still be getting stronger, still be getting fitter, and hopefully, developing all the positive adaptations that you'd like from exercise.
Okay. So let's imagine, Ed, then that I'm an athlete. I've been training for a long time and I actually now want to start competing in the CrossFit Games.
Yeah.
I know you've got the two group programs. I'd like you to walk us through those, but wouldn't it be better for me to do just personal training if I'm really serious about being a competitor?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with our performance competitors program. So generally speaking, obviously the stimulus is very different in those two groups because we're actually having to expose people to, the craziness of the sport. And again, it's still done in a systematic approach whereby they're not, going after hard workouts all year round. We have blocks of time during the year where we're focusing on technique and movement quality and basic strength development. And then we have times of the year where we have to expose you to the sport, which is just a bit more variance, a bit more intensity, a bit crazier. Just like, before a rugby game or a rugby competition, you would start to do more rugby rather than more training. And so what we typically have is the performance program. We actually still have a pretty big group of followers who do it. And everyone who's in our performance program has been exposed to weightlifting or weight training or resistance training for at least 2 years. They've met all of our movement and strength prerequisites that you need to have to be in that group. And they're kind of invested in a journey of wanting to test their fitness in a competition of some sort. The only difference in the performance competitors is that the competitors has generally more training volume. It's people who've probably been exposed to the training methodology of CrossFit a little bit longer. They have higher aspirations to compete in the sport than just the open. They might want to do things like the Asia Championships, maybe push to make it as an individual or a team competitor at regionals. But I think kind of the example you gave there, which is great because we have it all the time, is that eventually group programming is going to not be enough for some people. And those people might have, higher elevated goals in the sport. They can train more than 5 times a week. They can train more than 1 hour each time. And therefore they kind of come to us and say, hey, look, I'm really invested in being as good as I can possibly be within this sport. Like, what do I need to do? I feel like the group program isn't specific enough to what I need to do. And so our next conversation is then to say, hey, maybe we look towards moving you towards individualized coaching. And in the individualized coaching, we basically have 2 options. One is personal training, where you're working, day in, day out with a coach. And obviously that's very expensive and probably not very realistic to most people. And the second option is moving to an individualized program that we do remotely, and that's called our iTrain program. So the iTrain program typically works where you'll be teamed up with a coach and you'll start a relationship and a journey with that coach, where the coach is delivering an individualized training program to get you towards, whatever your goal might be within the sport. And actually we have a lot of people who follow our iTrain program who don't have any competitive aspirations whatsoever. They may just be chasing, just general improvements in everyday life and quality of life, or, body composition, or they may be a rugby player, or we have, squash players, trail runners, a whole bunch of different people. But I think obviously we need to do some really thorough profiling of people before they actually commit, before we kind of give them the green light on the iTrain program, whether it's the best thing for them. Because I think there's just a whole nother level of commitment and self-motivation that needs to be there if you're going to be successful with that program.
Okay, so just to recap then, the iTrain program sounds like it covers all types of people. The person that you mentioned that would do the foundation course right up into the competitors. Is it an online course?
So, we typically communicate with our clients online. A lot of our iTrain clients will actually supplement their remote program with some personal training sessions as well. So, we'll set up a document where the coach and client can both access it, or it's an online blog. And basically weekly or daily or monthly, clients will receive their training program. But basically they're on their own to then, start making their way through the program and leaving feedback for the coach. And primarily the relationship is developed online. I think there's obviously pros and cons to that. There's just some things that as a coach you'll never see when you're working with clients just online. I mean, things like, body language when they come into the gym, facial expressions when they're attacking a workout, small intricacies of what's happening to their foot when they squat, or, why are they not succeeding with snatching or technical movement. So it's always a tricky one. I think it's funny. I think a lot of people have kind of developed this idea that having an individualized online program is the best thing for me if I can't afford personal training. We've actually been running the program for a long time now. We've seen a lot of people have success with it. And we've also seen a lot of people not to have success with it. And I think, kind of like I said before, you need to be someone who is really self-aware, who's really self-motivated, can push and drive yourself without, necessarily having a coach there watching you all day, every day, but to also be really invested in the process and whatever that is. So, doing your own research on how to get better at a movement or how to mobilize a joint or how to fix an injury issue, because it's really hard to, I guess, handhold and guide someone when you're just working with them remotely online.
But I assume these programs are very tailored to the individual.
Yep.
Okay, so this brings me to my next question, because last week on the show, we had the founder of Spartan Races, Joe DeSena, and he inspired a lot of our listeners to get out there and do a Spartan race. And as a result, I've got some books left over that he's written about how to become a pro at Spartan Racing. And so we've got an offer that anyone who would like to send me an email at ali@ali.fitness will receive one of these books. But also, I believe that you or your studio is their preferred studio for training competitors in Hong Kong. So can you tell us a bit about what your program looks like, and also maybe even your individual program for those who aspire to be Spartans?
Yeah, I actually did my first Spartan race last year. It was a lot of fun. And actually, from a training methodology standpoint, it's not too dissimilar from something like a CrossFit program, I guess, given the fact that there's a lot of varied functional movements that you need to excel at in order to be good at Spartan racing. So, yeah, we actually worked with Spartan Race Hong Kong when they started last year, and we basically ran some free classes for anyone who wanted to start prepping themselves for the first race, which I think was a sprint event. So that was really cool. It forced us to have to do some research and start to learn more about, what was required to be good at Spartan racing. We actually have a few people now who they call themselves elite obstacle course runners, which is something completely new to me because I didn't know that existed. But people who actually are trying to peak for these competitions year round, not just in Hong Kong, but kind of traveling around Asia. And that's kind of become their sport now. It's actually really cool because it's the same way that CrossFit became people's sports, but I guess 5 or 6 years ago. So our training programs, what we'll typically do is that the group classes that we run, because we don't have that long working with people, it's more just to expose them to how a Spartan race might feel, to do some segmented skill pieces on developing things like rope climbs, bucket carries, sandbag carries, all that kind of stuff that you're going to be exposed from the race. But unfortunately, it's not a class that we run periodically throughout the year. So it's hard to really create some solid training adaptations from it because we just don't have enough time with the people. But obviously, if you have an individualized program for someone who's going to be, attacking or who plans to compete in a Spartan race, then obviously that would be very different.
Absolutely. So Ed, I've got to ask you, you're very experienced in Hong Kong and obviously the UK. What concerns, if any, do you have with the current industry?
Current industry meaning just the CrossFit industry or just the personal training industry?
Yeah, not just CrossFit. I'm talking like personal training. You can take this question any which way you like, from any angle. But are there any concerns that you have being in the industry?
Yeah. All right. Hopefully I don't rant too much, so stop me if I do. I think just one of the biggest issues in our industry is just the lack of barriers to entry. I think it's really easy for anyone to not have to do much work and all of a sudden be in a position to call themselves, a health coach, which is essentially what we are. And I guess, when you look at health coaches and personal trainers, we're almost in the same bracket as doctors and physios in a sense that people are willing to pay a lot of money to listen and follow our advice, which hopefully leads to an improvement of life or fixing of an injury or a health issue, that kind of thing. And I think when you look at the process that doctors and physios and chiros and, anyone in that industry have to go through to become a certified practitioner, it's obviously very long, very lengthy and very thorough. Whereas to become a personal trainer, well, actually, there isn't really any qualification. I think pretty much anyone can, decide one day that they want to be a PT without a certification. But most certifications like NASM and other ones in the UK, and I think it's called ACE in the US, are actually really straightforward and generally is just a multiple choice exam that you can finish off in a month or so. So I think that's a big issue. And I think it's not any fault of the personal trainers and the coaches in the industry. It's more of a fault of the system, I think, in the sense that there's a lack of quality control in both the certification process, but also the monitoring of of coaches. And, just like any industry, there's always going to be good coaches and there's going to be bad coaches, just like there'll be good doctors and bad coaches. But I definitely foresee that being, one of the biggest issues that we have, because I think all it takes is for one person to have one bad experience with a coach for them to then throw a blanket statement over all personal training coaches or personal trainers and coaches to say that, it's not worthwhile, don't do it. And I think that's, just on a segueing away from that, that's something that we have to deal with as a gym that offers a CrossFit training methodology, is that, a lot of people have had a bad experience with CrossFit or have read something bad on the internet or, being told something by their friend, and therefore they're very quick to throw a blanket statement to say like, this isn't for me, I've heard it's dangerous type thing. So that is probably one of the biggest issues that we see.
I was just going to say, that isn't such a bad call either. A lot of people do get injured, and perhaps it's because many gyms, and not just CrossFit gyms, but many gyms, many personal trainers don't take their clients through that process of, hey, hang on, how do you move before I add some weight?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, look, that's a really valid point. Is there anything else that you would perhaps, I guess, give some advice to our listeners if they're looking for a personal trainer or someone of those sorts, maybe even a group class? What advice would you give?
Ooh, again, lots, I think. I think the first things first is always do your research. It's very hard when you're looking at a superficial level on something like a website, because it looks like everyone has a really good CV. So trying to find out if you know someone who's worked with a coach. And I think you don't need to be an expert to know if a coach is worth their money or not. Basic things like how invested they are in your journey. I think basic things like organization and efficiency and turning up on time and listening to you are really important things. And I guess the add-ons to that are things like, how thorough is their assessment process? Are they just trying to get you in for a quick fix or a quick sale, or are they actually invested in longevity and long-term success? I think those are all little things to look for. But I think kind of just stemming from that, just make sure that if you're looking for a coach or a gym to start working with, I think you have to always give it time as well. Unless, it's just a really awful initial experience. A lot of gyms and coaches, some do, some don't, but don't believe in quick fixes. And I think healthy gains and healthy adaptations take a long time. And I think in order to see the success of a coach or a training methodology or a gym or even a diet, you just need to give it time and consistency. And I think if you can safely say that you have given it time and consistency and you're still not getting to where you want, then I think that's probably the time to start looking at other options. But I definitely think clients as well as coaches or just general public are too fixated on short-term gains versus long-term success. And I think part of the reason of that is social media and what we read in magazines, and a lot of personal training and fitness companies are based around transformation challenges, which will always sell a quick fix and how shredded you can get in 12 weeks. But I think at the end of the day, most people are in this for the long term, whether they know it or not, or whether they realize it or not. So yeah, I guess just do your research just like you would research into buying a new house.
That's a really good point. And that's one thing that I really noticed when I went to your gym was just that community that you've built, and people aren't there for the short term. It's a long-term commitment, and it's all about the process, which you could see in all your participants and how much sort of enjoyment that brought to them as well.
That's really cool that you can see that. I think a big part of that comes in that first conversation that you have, as a gym or as a coach with your client. And to be really honest and upfront and say, hey, look, I know definitely for us, we're not about the quick fix. And we're going to be very honest with people who sometimes come and say, hey, I just want to get abs in the next 6 weeks. Can you do that for me? And usually we're like, well, what are you willing to do to sacrifice, in your life, I guess, to make that choice? And is that really the choice you want to be making, in the long term? And I think if you can be honest and from the get-go and set some standards and benchmarks from day one, I think it just sets both you and your client up for a much, well, firstly, realistic, but probably more successful journey.
Yeah, well explained, Ed. Really good. So, Ed, before I let you go, a little personal question for you. Do you have a tattoo?
No, I don't have a tattoo.
You don't?
Probably one of the only coaches at Coast Fitness that doesn't have a tattoo, actually.
Well, probably one of the only people under 35 that doesn't have a tattoo.
Yeah, should probably look at getting one.
So why not?
I get asked that a lot. I think people always assume that personal trainers have tattoos. I think I'm a pretty clean-cut guy, and maybe not out of choice because I don't grow facial hair, unfortunately. I kind of wish I did. So I just don't know if tattoos go well with clean-cut guys. Maybe I should try it.
Love it. Excellent. Look, Ed, thank you for your time. We're going to put your website in the show notes and any other links that you'd like us to put in there so that our listeners can check out all your programs. And I'm sure if they mention Ali Fitness when they come to see you, you'll look after them.
Absolutely, Ali, for sure.
Excellent. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Ed. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Ali. It's been a lot of fun.
For all the resources and show notes from today's episode, please go to www.ali.fitness. If you liked today's episode, please show your appreciation by going to iTunes, give us a 5-star review and subscribe.